Was the pandemic used to hypnotise and terrify you? Yes, it was. And now we can prove it. Hello there, you 6.4 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on this voyage to truth and freedom. Within you, there is a deep love and a deep power. Do not let them shut you down. Do not let them turn you against one another. Let us remain united. Let us remain focused on the real problems. Centralized authority, disruptive and dishonest agencies. Let us form new alliances together. Turn on the notification bell right now. We make this content every single day and we make it just for you. The algorithm will direct you to mainstream media propaganda. We will do our best to bring you the truth, all the while acknowledging our own fallibility and flaws. It is what makes us human. You don't want to live in an AI dystopia, do you? Let's hope we get a choice, baby. I spoke to Laura Dodsworth about the pandemic and the way they used behavioralism, nudging tactics, and propaganda to keep us in a state of fear so that we were primed for changes that would be beneficial to the state. This is a fantastic conversation. Many of your fears, many of your doubts, much of your cynicism is confirmed by this conversation. That's why you're going to want to stay to the end in order that we be better educated together.
This is a quote from the advisor on SPIB. Do you know what that is, advisor on SPIB? Are we talking about like that nudge unit and all that type of stuff?
I know exactly what this is because this is somebody that I interviewed for my book. SPIB is the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviours. They're a group of social scientists, behavioural psychologists, various social scientists. And what they do is give the government advice in times of emergency, such as a pandemic. And I interviewed several of them when I was researching my book, A State of Fear. And this one here broke cover, actually, to speak to me because he was so concerned about the way the government was using fear and behavioural psychology. I mean, to not mince our words, the government used fear to control you in lockdown.
That's fascinating. And in a sense, perhaps it's something that we would have anticipated and something that we can appreciate. Sometimes I try to approach the extraordinary events of the last couple of years in good faith, not to the denial of what is evident and plain, that there have been regulations, legislations and advantages that have been accrued through that period that appear to point to an agenda, but at least not to leap to conclusions. Perhaps you and I together through the course of our conversation can highlight a case for how the pandemic was a revealing period, how we learned about how power functions, how we learn about how propaganda operates and how we are manipulated, how our behavior is affected by messaging. Starting with this quote, Laura, that we've just referred to. The way we've used fear is dystopian. We have a totalitarian government in respect to propaganda, but all governments engage with propaganda. The use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been like a weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. So there was an explicit intention to use fear. It's interesting to note that in the end, we're dealing with a basic palette of emotion, rage and fear and shame. And even when something feels secular, mechanical and bureaucratic, its resources are quite emotional and deep, and that obviously raises ethical questions. Do you think that there was an ethical breach in the way that this pandemic was handled? Do you think that they understood things that they didn't convey, and do you think that they highlighted aspects of the pandemic, or whether that's medically or socially, in order to pursue a agenda that was not plain or explicit?
Wow, there's so much to pick up on there. But I'm going to go back to your first point, that you approach this with good faith. And I think that's really important, because when I wrote the book, there were a lot of people that just said to me, well, why? Why would the government use fear? As though it had to indicate that there was some evil conspiracy theory or agenda. You know, there may or may not be, but there's a very simple answer to the question. And that is that governments use fear because it encourages compliance. There is a gap between your rational thoughts and your suppressed emotions. And it's that gap that allows governments or any would-be manipulator to control you, to manipulate you, to exert undue influence on you. And fear is the steam in the emotional engine. Fear is the big one. Is it a breach of ethics to use fear? I think this really depends on where you sit personally and ideologically. I would probably put myself right at one end of the spectrum that says you should not use fear to control people. It is unethical. If this was a laboratory experiment, if a psychologist wanted to put their fingers in your brain, reach around and use fear to control you to see what happens, then they would need to go through an ethics approval procedure. You would sign a consent form. None of us signed consent forms at the beginning of the lockdown, did we? And what's more, at the end of the experiment, they would make sure that you left happy. You know, you would probably watch a rom-com and have a slice of chocolate cake. They wouldn't send you out a gibbering wreck with COVID anxiety syndrome. There was never any end to this. The advisors that I interviewed for A State of Fear, the ones who spoke to me on the record and those who spoke to me anonymously, I asked them all, what is the plan for de-escalating fear? And there was no plan. What really worried me and sent chills down my spine actually were a couple of advisors who were not only very content with the use of fear because they thought it was proportionate in a pandemic, because pandemics are frightening. But they said, well, hang on a minute, why would we de-escalate fear? We will move from this to the next crisis, which is climate. And I think that, you know, there is a risk here that governments lean on fear and nudge, which is a form of behavioral psychology and propaganda, to shut down debate, legislation, disagreement, in fact, because these covert ways to influence you are successful and they bypass all that kind of procedure. So if you know, the COVID pandemic and the lockdown created what academics have called a window of malleability. Our habits changed. And that meant we were ripe for more change. You know, it's a great time then to push the idea of changing habits towards, say, net zero goals.
When you say covert, what covert modes were utilized? Do you think that the entire endeavour is to a degree covert because they were not explicit about their operation? It's obviously incredibly convenient that many of the things that were used to mobilise fear and compliance have subsequently been demonstrably untrue, whether that's the efficacy of the medication,
Allegedly.
or the origins of the virus,
Allegedly.
or many of the subsequent measures. So what was covert, Laura?
I think a lot of it is covert. You know, a pandemic is an emergency. But back in February 2020, World Health Organization documents showed that at that point, it was very well understood that COVID risk was stratified according to your age and your clinical status. So the elderly or people with particular comorbidities were more at risk. By March 2020, we locked down. And the government's obviously asked this panel, SPY-B, a question, crikey, what are we going to do? We're going to lock down. We're going to mass quarantine the healthy. How are we going to make sure people follow this rule? Because it's unprecedented. I know from talking to these advisors, they were worried about things like, you know, the poor old working class chap missing football in the pub. You know, it's kind of classist assumptions going on here. And so SPY-B advisors reply with this whole gamut of suggestions. One is that people's sense of personal threat needed to be increased because they were complacent, because they understood the risk to their demographic group. Another way of looking at that is that people understood very well what the risk was. They understood the risk to their age. If I think back to that time, my mum started shielding long before they were supposed to. Yeah. She's in her 70s, she's got terminal lung conditions, she's poorly. Her and her husband hold themselves up. I, on the other hand, was trying to finish a big photography project, and I thought, right, okay, you know, my work might be thrown off the table for a while. I'm off. I'm taking some hand sanitizer. I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to go into services. You know, we understood our risk. The SPY-B advisors never explained how they would only target the complacent or those at risk. No, what happened was the government operationalized a campaign to make everybody frightened. This isn't unheard of in public health problems. If you think back to AIDS in the 1980s, we were told that everybody would know someone that died of AIDS within 10 years. And that didn't happen. You know, that never came to pass. I don't know anyone, luckily, who died of AIDS. So there's a kind of a trend in public health to increase the sense of risk, to democratize the sense of risk, if you like. So to stop people being complacent, to increase their sense of risk, they did things like ads. You know, nearly £1 billion was spent across 11 government departments in the UK over 3 years, most of it on COVID. So many ads, some of them taken quite a horror film aesthetic. They were designed to make you feel that, if your loved one died, it was your fault.
Well, what a fantastic conversation that was. Remember, we're back on Rumble every single day from June 5th, a 1 hour long daily show full of fun, frolics, fantasy, chaos, mayhem, and above all else, hard truths about a hard world that could become better if we're willing to awaken together. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. Turn on that notification bell right now. But remember, more important than any of that is that you please stay free.